খণ্ডন ভব বন্ধন জগ বন্দন বন্দিত মায় নিরঞ্জন নাররূপ ধার নিরঞ্জন নাররূপ ধার নির্গুণ গুণময় মোক্ষণ অঘদূষণ জগভূষণ চিদ্ঘন কায় জ্ঞান জান বিমল নয়ন জ্ঞান জান বিমল নয়ন বিশ্বনে মোহ যায় ভাস্কর ভাব সাগর চির উন্মাদ প্রেম পাহাড় ভক্তর জন যুগল রণ ভক্তর জন যুগল চরণ তারণ ভব রিম্ভিতম যুগ ঈশ্বর জগ ঈশ্বর যোগ সায় নিরধন সমাহিত মান নিরধন সমাহিত মান নিরখিত কৃপা ভঞ্জন দুঃখ গঞ্জন করুণাঘন কর্ম প্রাণার্পণ জগত তারণ প্রাণার্পণ জগত তারণ কৃন্তান কলি বার দেহ পাদে অনুরাগ নির্ভয় গাতম সংশয় দৃঢ় নিশ্চয় মানস বান নিষ্কারণ ভগত শরণ নিষ্কারণ ভগত শরণ ত্যাজি যাতে হলো সম্পদ তব শ্রীপাদ ভব পুষ্পাদ বারিজ প্রেমার পান সমদারশান প্রেমার পান সমদারশান জগ জন দুঃখ যায় সম্পদ তব শ্রীপদ ভব পুষ্পদ পারিজাতায় প্রেমার পদ সমদর্শন প্রেমার পদ সমদর্শন জগ জন দুঃখ যায় নমো নমো প্রভু বাকমনাতীত নমো নমো मन वचनैकाधार प्रभु मन वचनैकाधार ज्योतिरज्योतिर् जलनिधि कंदर ज्योतिरज्योतिर् जलनिधि कंदर तुमि तम भंजनहार प्रभु तुमि तम भंजनहार नमो नमो प्रभु बाकमनातीत नमो नमो प्रभु बाकमनातीत मन वचनैकाधार प्रभु मन वचनैकाधार ज्योतिरज्योतिर् जलनिधि कंदर ज्योतिरज्योतिर् जलनिधि कंदर तुमि तम भंजनहार प्रभु तुमि तम भंजनहार दे लंग रंग भंग बाजे शंग मृदंग दे लंग रंग भंग बाजे शंग मृदंग गाइছে ছন্দ ভক্ত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার গাইছে ছন্দ ভক্ত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার জয় জয় আরতি তোমার হর হর আরতি তোমার শিব শিব আরতি তোমার অন্দান ভাব বন্ধান জগ বন্দান বন্দিত মায় জয় শ্রী গুরু মহারাজ কি জয়। ॐ ह्रीं ऋतं तमोचल गुणाजित गुणेभ्यः नाप्तं तेवां सकरुणां तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे जतोऽहं तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्तलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वम् वक्त्रधृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ते तरसा त्वयि तृप्ततृष्णा रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि रामकृष्णे मार्तावृतं तव पदं मरणोर्विनाशं तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारी स्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेकगम्य तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गल मङ्गले शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये नारायणी नमोस्तुते सृष्टिस्थिति विनाशानां शक्तिभूत नारायणी नमोस्तुते शरणागत दीनार्त परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्थे हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते जय 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 महामाई की जय जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
नमः श्री अतिराजाय विवेकानंद सूरे सच्चित् सुख स्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे. So we had come to this point in this lecture by Vivekananda, Maya and Illusion, where this whole business of what this word, much maligned word Maya really means, is these antipodes of contradiction that define our existence. So in that sense, in a pretty fundamental sense, it's a statement of fact. And he had mentioned, this is where we had stopped last time, that what is the strangest thing? I've said this a couple of times here. This from the Yaksha Prashna of the Mahabharata. The Yaksha asks Yudhishthira, what is the strangest thing on earth? And Yudhishthira replies, Ahanyahani bhutani gacchanti yama mandiram sheshasthiramichanti kimascharya atafparam. So every day people are dying around us, and yet we think that we will never die. Yeah? And essentially, this contradiction between fact and our day-to-day behavior, yeah, between existential fact and the way we behave in everyday life, we do not believe, we do not act as if death is knocking on our door. So this contradiction between facts of life, and this is in some sense sort of an extreme fact, that life ends in death. On the other hand, we behave as if we will remain alive eternally. And he goes on to say, these tremendous contradictions in our intellect, in our knowledge, yea, in all the facts of our life, face us on all sides. And then he further gives some further examples. A reformer arises and wants to remedy the evils that are existing in a certain nation. And before they have been remedied, 1,000 other evils arise in another place. It is like an old house that is falling. You patch it up in one place and the ruin extends to another. In India, this is late 19th century mind, our reformers cry, or early 20th, our reformers cry and preach against the evil. This one is, I think, late 19th. Yeah. Against the evils of enforced widowhood. In the West, non-marriage is the great evil. Help the unmarried on one side, they are suffering. Help the widows on the other, they are suffering. It is like chronic rheumatism. You drive it from the head and it goes to the body. You drive it from there and it goes to the feet. Reformers arise and preach that learning, wealth, and culture should not be in the hands of a select few. And they do their best to make them accessible to all. These may bring more happiness to some, but perhaps as culture comes, physical happiness lessens. The knowledge of happiness brings the knowledge of unhappiness. Which way then shall we go? The least amount of material prosperity that we enjoy is causing the same amount of misery elsewhere. This is the law. The young perhaps do not see it clearly, but those who have lived long enough and those who have struggled enough will understand it. And this is Maya. These things are going on day and night, and to find a solution of this problem is impossible. Why should it be so? It is impossible to answer this because the question itself cannot be logically formulated. There is neither why, neither how, nor why in fact. We only know that it is and that we cannot help it. Even to grasp it, to draw an exact image of it in our own mind, is beyond our power. How can we solve it then? So another instance of this particular problem, of these contradictions that define our existence, is being elaborated. What is the root of this contradiction? And why is it so difficult to grasp conceptually? We see that it is a certain phenomenon of existence. Our day-to-day lives are conditioned by value judgments. This is good, this is bad. This is going to bring me happiness, this is going to bring me sorrow, etc., etc. Why is it so difficult to grasp? And in order to understand this, the difficulty of the problem conceptually, either we can simply say, now look, this is a statement of fact. Yes, there is life. Life is full of happiness and misery. Life is full of sorrow and happiness, etc., etc. And there are these contradictory features, contradictory aspects of our subjective existence that define our existence. Yeah, fine. And then decide not to probe further, not to question further. In other words, we are declaring that we want to be zombies. We do not want to be humans who want to inquire, but decide to dull our mind and not inquire further. That solution, yes, that's available, but it certainly is not particularly satisfactory to the inquiring mind. Human beings from the very dawn of civilization have looked around at this world and have tried to make sense of it. All our deeper endeavors, all science, art, social work, all of this doing good to the world, etc., etc., all of it is an attempt in some form to make sense of this greater existence around us. Now, where do these contradictions arise from? And I think, at least in part, if you look at the way humans have evolved as a species, we do get not an answer to this question, but at least where the problems originate from. Where are these two contradictory aspects of our life, one leading to something larger and one leading to something more constricted? Where do these aspects of our lives, in some sense, happiness is something that makes us a little broader, a little larger, and unhappiness sort of constricts the feelings, makes us smaller. Good is, in this very general sense, is something that is for some kind of greater benefit, and bad is something that is for very limited benefit, bringing possibly suffering to a larger number of people. So, in this particular psychological fact of something that is larger and something that is smaller in terms of number of human beings involved, in this particular psychological fact, we might try to find an answer to this particular question, not in terms of an absolute answer, but where the question originates from. And actually, I am hinting at a fundamental question: are we as a species hardwired? Is it in our constitution, biologically, to live in the midst of these contradictions? Yeah? So the statement of fact in terms of our external existence, in terms of our psychological existence, in terms of these value judgments, which are purely psychological in nature, is there a biological basis for this? As a species, does our biology dictate that we are creatures of contradiction? And I think that the answer to that question is really yes. It's not that we'll get an answer to this question. It's not that we'll be resolving this question. What we will get is a clearer understanding of the ramifications of this contradiction and how deep-rooted it is in our psyche. Broadly, the human brain, this is not a theory that is, this has been a biological theory that has been around for a while, but there are subtleties. So let's ignore some of these subtleties, and I'll just give you some sort of a coarse-grained idea of how the human mind or its support, its locus, namely the human brain, functions. So the human brain has one particular part, namely this part behind the forehead. It's called the prefrontal cortex, which comprises about 45% or nearly half of the brain volume. Our nearest evolutionary relative, namely the chimpanzee, in the chimpanzee, the corresponding part occupies something like 9%, 1/5 of the brain volume. So there's a drastic difference there. What are the principal functions of this aspect? These are really the higher brain functions. And if you want sort of two clear indicators, we've mentioned this before. One is discrimination analysis, going to clear judgments, objective evaluative thinking. The other is altruism. And that comes from where? It comes from the fact that we can have an internal map of this larger world that we live in, and it's mapped inside. And that basically tells us that there are these zillions and zillions of other people whose existence is something that my individual existence is deeply related to. This dependence of my existence on the so-called other. What are we doing in the process? We are, the highest development of the human brain is essentially integrating the existence, this larger existence, into one's own existence and regarding oneself at some level, we say intellectually, but really it is happening at a fairly essential level. We are integrating ourselves into this larger existence which consists of societies. That's how human beings came up with societies. That's how human beings came up with shared narratives. All organized religions are nothing more than shared narratives. There are some stories, mythologies. This is what people told each other. How far back do they go? Maybe 5,000 years at the outside. It's not even a drop in the ocean compared to the evolution of the universe, which is some 12 or 13 billion years. Yeah? This is a few thousand. Just compare. It's 6 orders of magnitude different. Yeah? Okay. But this is a special human capacity that has developed. Evolution has equipped us with it, and we have really used it to the fullest extent over the last 10,000, 12,000 years. Another shared narrative, without which modern society would not move at all, is this notion of money. Yeah? It's an exchange. So, say a few thousand years back, there was no currency. How did people go about? They would go about using barter. Somebody would give somebody a bag of wheat, they would get back a bag of sugar in return, etc. Early trade was based on barter. Then we decided that as a species, we'll build this narrative into our societies, this story into our societies. And that story is called money. You have a discipline that deals with that narrative. It's called economics. Yeah? So human beings as a species do have a capacity for shared narratives. And this narrative binds us together. By the way, what I'm saying is not, I mean, it's largely culled from this book called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. So what is special about the human species? So this is one particular aspect. All right. So these are aspects which tie us together, generalized altruism, so to speak. The other is this capacity for analysis. Where does this reside? It resides in the forebrain. About half the brain is devoted to this activity. Now, there is another more evolutionarily more primitive part of the human brain. What is that? That's what basically allows us to live in a fairly primitive form. When human beings had not formed civilizations, where the existence was essentially an animal existence, say hunter-gatherer existence, what would we do? As a species, we lived largely either on the move or in forests, and these forests were infested by wild animals, snakes, tigers, etc., etc. So to preserve oneself and to sustain oneself, namely to gather food and to prevent oneself from being eaten, being converted to food, we had to have certain features, evolutionary features. What were those? Those are these instincts, self-preservation instincts. And how do they manifest? Essentially through either fight, capacity to fight, or run away, flight. Yeah? And these are controlled by hand. Your hand immediately goes and tries to slap that part. Yeah? This is not even sent to the higher processing centers in the brain. It's an impulsive reaction. It's a reaction guided by this attempt to preserve oneself. Now, evolutionarily, both have their place. One for preservation of the species, which is why fight or flight is necessary. The other is a certain societal development which has attained probably its fruition mostly at a human level. It's not exclusive, but it's certainly highly developed at the human level. All right. Now, both of these are beneficial. Where is the contradiction? And here's the point. Till 10,000 or maybe a little more, 12,000 years back, the Earth's climate was not suitable for the development of civilizations as we know it today. For instance, if you look at the average temperature during the year, and now you plot how much this temperature fluctuates, the average temperature during a year. So you're taking, say, 365 days, and you're looking at average temperature in a particular place. And you ask, well, if the average temperature was such and such, say 30 degrees Celsius in year 1, and now you try to plot that change, fluctuations in temperature over, say, 100 years. And it turns out that this fluctuation in yearly average mind could be as much as 10 degrees when it was more than 12,000 years back. But during these past 10,000 years or so, not now, but till say 1950, that had decreased. These fluctuations had decreased. And the average temperature had stabilized so that from year to year, the yearly average would fluctuate by maybe 1 degree or so, which is why we can say that, look, on an average, these months will be cold, these months will be pleasant, these months will be hot, these months will be rainy, etc., etc. The very notion of seasons, right now it's raining here. This is supposed to be the rainy season, and it is supposed to rain in the rainy season. This very feature that we take for granted today is not something that the earth was accustomed to maybe 12,000 years back. So what happens when you have this kind of regulated fluctuation of average temperature? Essentially what has happened so essentially what has happened is that this kind of fluctuation, being so small, allows for a certain level of stability. This allows people to settle down in one place and form societies the way we have them today. This has been slowly growing. I mean, it goes back to, say, the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, etc., where there was a certain group of people who came together, there was division of labor, and people took up various things, and societies were formed on the basis of division of labor. Okay. But now what has happened? Then, over a space of 10,000 years, because this kind of fluctuation in climate is relatively less, what happens is that we can turn ourselves to problems that are more sophisticated, our basic needs being taken care of, and then we start asking more fundamental questions about this earth around us, and we start enquiring. That has given rise to all art, science, culture, all our collective activities, etc., etc. So, societal evolution and biological evolution are aimed at two different things. Societal evolution, if you want to look at the direction towards which it is going, ideally, it culminates in a global village. Yeah. What does that mean? It means essentially identifying with this species which we call human beings, and that's got a name. It's called humanism, or this idea that humanity is one and that we have one planet, etc., etc. Hence, basically, the movements nowadays towards making us aware that, look, there is just this one earth on which this 7.2 billion people are living. It's our responsibility to make sure that this particular kind of equilibrium is something that we can hand over to the next generation and the generation after that, so that this kind of equilibrium on an average is sustained. Where does that instinct come from to return? Broadly speaking, it's born out of these higher brain functions of human beings. On the other hand, there is this tendency which really has animal origins, where we used to fight for territory, where we used to fight for food, etc., etc. These instincts have been given to us by our biological evolution. And they are not going to go away by wishing them away. So the conflicts that we see between nation and nation, between one person and another, between one community and another, really when you look at it, it all boils down to this aspect of the human brain which tries to find smaller tribes, maybe expand, because I don't have individually enough power, so I tie up with, say, 10 other people and try to fight a community that is trying to cause me some harm. Yeah? This is the root of this trouble. And so we see that if you look at the root of this contradictory existence, one going towards expansion, the other going towards constriction, these really are hardwired into us in the way the hindbrain, the more primitive part of the brain, given to fight, flight, essentially all our passions, anger, hatred, etc., all of them originate there. The reason these things are there is that they are leftovers of a certain evolution of the species. And the forebrain, which has really come about by trying to integrate all this information into some consolidated unit, is at a variance with this leftover of evolution. And really, it's about 50-50. Yeah? The parts of the brain that sustain us and the parts of the brain that try to mark out a trajectory towards societal evolution, a more holistic, integrated evolution, these are at variance with each other. So this psychological fact of contradiction does have biological origins. In the introduction to the Brahma Sutras, there's a bhashya by Shankara called the Adhyasa Bhashya, where he talks about this, but not from a biological point of view, but from a purely psychological point of view. Once one tries to inquire into the roots of one's individual being, one immediately arrives at the intellectual, logical conclusion that it is not individuated by this principle that we call the body or the mind, and hence, if one catches hold of this I, it's consciousness alone. In spite of having this kind of a logical conclusion, ahamidam mama idam iti naisargikoyam loka vyavahara. That's what he says. In spite of having this kind of an intellectual conviction, even greatly learned people, when it comes to day-to-day behavior, they behave as if this is mine and this is me. In other words, in practice, we keep behaving as if this particular body is what I am. So, on the one hand, this unified, generalized kind of thinking which guides all our higher endeavors, on the one hand, the other, this preservation of ourselves as an individual animal, so to speak, these are very often in conflict with each other, and this conflict has been hardwired into us, and because it comes from two different kinds of origins. One, biological evolution gave rise to us as a species, and it taught us to fight or flight. Yeah? On the other hand, societal evolution, which the instrument behind that was the human brain, well, there is some controversy as to which came first, but most likely it's the brain sort of that developed. And then this decided that, look, we can map various the world into ourselves and start thinking of it as a more unified whole. And all our knowledge is born out of this principle. All our culture is born out of this principle. All higher human endeavors are born out of this principle. So this particular pair of antipodes, if one understands it more or less dispassionately, then one sees that, look, these are aspects of even our being at a purely biological level in terms of evolution. Not that it's going to help us solve this contradiction, but it's going to allow us to understand this contradiction better. Which means what? Which means when we are in a particular situation, then we will be able to discriminate. Are we allowing ourselves to take this broader perspective which is fueled by our evolution as societies? Or am I reacting purely on the basis of what biological evolution has left in my structure? These ideas were not developed to the extent that they are developed today thanks to modern science. So people in these days, in these more classical texts, they would look at it from a more subjective point of view, and they would call these leftovers samskaras, tendencies of the mind. Well, yes, they are, but they are deeply correlated. This is the field which studies today what are called neurological correlates of consciousness. These are deeply correlated with neuronal states. Where is that going to help us? Why is all this scientific jargon going to help us? It's basically going to help us understand which aspect of our personality is something that if we want to grow as a consolidated society, it is going to help us, and which ones are going to drag us back down to a more instinctive level. In other words, at a certain psychological crossroads, one will be able to step back and ask oneself, look, is this heading in this direction or this direction? This is an overly simplified version, but at least we will be able to step back and think about it, and then come to an informed decision. Yeah? This is, I think, the point that I wanted to drive home today. Essentially, that these contradictions are not something that we need to take ourselves to task about. It's not something that these facts of life are something that has just happened out of the blue, but there are very concrete biological reasons and then reasons of human evolution as societies that do lead to these contradictions that define our existence today, yeah, as members of this species that we belong to. Yeah? It's not something esoteric, not something that you will have to draw from mythology to explain, but if you just look around you, the way the world is today, and you extract impersonal knowledge which is incontrovertible, independent of various cultures, then it is going to provide to you a fairly concrete universal explanation where these contradictions come from. So we'll return to this again next time. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.